Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Deep in the heart of continental North America, in the area that is now called the state of Wyoming, the Wild West, for thousands of years, there was a pristine, cold-temperate ecosystem dominated by vast sagebrush and grasslands and mountain forests, and tremendous biodiversity. Songbirds, deer, bison, and elk, rivers with trout and beavers, and of course predators, bears, foxes, and wolves. This ecosystem had been in harmonic balance ever since the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, even when indigenous humans arrived and began to roam the mountains and meadows. Hunter-gatherer tribes like the Shoshone, the Crow, Arapaho, and Cheyenne. And even when European settlers invaded and displaced the indigenous hunter-gatherers and started reducing the biodiversity, replacing the bison and elk with cattle, and the diverse meadows and forests with fields of oat and wheat. Just the same, the wildlife was resilient and breathtaking, even up to 200 years ago. Until those European settlers decided it was time to exterminate all the wolves, because they were killing people and livestock. Ecologists argued for the creation of a gigantic wildlife preserve, what is now known as Yellowstone National Park, to protect the biodiversity. But just the same, the last wolves were killed in Yellowstone in 1926, only 100 years ago today. But then people noticed that the entire ecosystem was becoming unstable. The elk population went out of control, and the herds were getting increasingly unhealthy, with lots of very sick and injured elk hobbling around. But worse, all those elk were now free to devastate the groves of aspen, willow, and poplar, nibbling them down to the ground. That eliminated nesting places for so many species of birds and also decimated the beaver population. The loss of the beavers ruined the aquatic ecosystem because their dams had previously slowed the flow of water through the ecosystem. Now the riverbanks were eroding away and marsh life disappeared, which also eliminated a lot of bird life and other animals. The entire ecosystem was collapsing. Then in the 1970s, the Forestry Service started reintroducing wolves against much public opposition. And here's the thing, all of those ecological disruptions I just described, they all completely reversed. The birds and beavers and marshes came back. And anyone who has since been to Yellowstone Park will tell you how stunningly beautiful it now is.
I was there as a kid, and it hadn't, at that point, I guess, probably come back to the level that it is now, but I still have great memories of it. I read last year John Muir's. John Muir is the founder of the Sierra Club, and it's because of his work and his writing that those parks were, in fact, set aside. And I just would recommend to any of our listeners, if you read his writings, they're just fantastic. And you just come away with such a sense of the absolute beauty of nature, even red in tooth and claw, even though it's, there is a beauty to it.
Yeah.
Even though that beauty is in a lot of ways built on some things that are not particularly pleasant, like predation, right? And this comeback has been just such a huge surprise, even to the scientific community. I don't even think expected it to the level that it's been, which gives you hope. Yeah. Even though we've destroyed a lot of places, there is hope that we can bring them back.
Right. Yeah, and this was not just a one-off. You referred earlier there, Scott, to these parks, the reason that these parks were brought in. The exact same sequence of ecological events were noted in Zion National Park in Utah, in Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, Yosemite National Park in California, Olympic National Park in Washington, and Jasper National Park in Canada, in Alberta. All the same sequence of ecological events when the top predators, whether that they were wolf or cougar or lynx, when those predators were decimated or eliminated and then reintroduced. And for that reason, ecologists call these top predators keystone species, referring to the keystone of a stone archway that holds all the other stones in place. Remove that keystone and the arch comes tumbling down.
It's interesting because, the other term you often hear is apex predators, right? To the top of the food chain. And typically that has a bit of a bit of a negative connotation. But what we're seeing is that every piece of the puzzle of nature has a part to play. an important part to play. And if you remove any of those pieces, you don't just distort the picture, you ruin it,
I know, in so many ways, predation is behind a lot of the beauty we see in other parts of the biosphere. The speed and power and agility of both the gazelle and the cheetah, and the sleek lines of their bodies, are the product of their intimate predatory-prey relationship. In other words, the evolution of the gazelle drove the evolution of the cheetah, while the cheetah simultaneously drove the evolution of the gazelle. The amazing colors of many animals, butterflies, fish, birds, in many cases, these are the accidental byproducts of defense strategies intended first to prevent predation. The movement of ancient life onto land and all the amazing terrestrial life forms that have existed since then was in part driven by avoiding predation or exploiting new prey resources. The removal of sick and deformed individuals from the populations, leaving only the strong and healthy individuals, again, that's a product of predation. Predation drives health, innovation, resilience, and beauty, and it's always been that way since the beginning of life on our planet billions of years ago, and long, long before there were any humans on the planet.
Yeah, you can certainly understand Malthus. Malthus had the economist had this whole idea. He, based on experiments with, I think it was fruit flies, but they would grow a population of them. That population would explode, and then eventually, it would overpopulate, and then it would completely fall off. And this led to the idea of what are called Malthusian economics. And listening to you, it's a pretty dim picture, and not just for evangelicals, but I think for any thinking person. How do we respond to that humanly? Like, what is our role in this whole ecosystem? Because we think we stand outside it, but we're firmly within it.
This is not only for evangelicals or even Christians. This is also for people who are secular, who are atheists, who might see sometimes, boy, that's brutal. Life can be really brutal.
Mm-hmm.
But that having been said, this does raise much bigger problems for Christians, especially evangelicals.
Yeah.
The Young Earth Creationists among them don't like the idea of death and predation prior to the appearance of humans on the face of the planet, and that whole fall from grace described in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. For them, predation is a result of human sin and has only been around for a few thousand years, and it's not part of God's original plan for a good Earth, even though it is good for Yellowstone National Park. And predation is also a problem for the intelligent design crowd, because if one is going to introduce a designer for things that evoke awe and amazement, the intricate and beautiful things in life, then one needs to be consistent and do the same for the things that evoke horror and revulsion, like some of the amazing innovations that we find in predator-prey relationships.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you can't just have it one way. Like, does the deadly venom of a snake that has evolved, is that as beautiful as the wings of a beautiful butterfly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're going to talk about. Over the next few weeks, we're going to explore a few examples of extreme evolution, ones that are so problematic for so many Christians, and we'll look at the efforts that Christians go through to rationalize or dismiss those real-life examples. One discussion that has been making the rounds in the Young Earth Creationist world was an article published by Answers in Genesis just a few weeks ago. And again, Answers in Genesis, we've talked about this before, they're the leading resource for Young Earth Creationist ideology. You may have heard of Ken Ham or the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, and now the Great Ark Adventure. That's all AIG, Answers in Genesis. AIG are a mega industry in the Christian world. We talked about this a year or two ago in episode number 159. They're the biggest player in the Christian publishing business that focuses on books and learning resources going to parents and school systems that want a purely Young Earth Creationist curriculum. Zondervan is perhaps the biggest publisher in the Christian world in general. They put out books of all categories and genres, all types of theology and all types of worldviews, but AIG takes in almost as much annual revenue as Zondervan does, even though they focus exclusively on a Young Earth Creationist market.
Yeah, that's astonishing. I didn't realize that. That amazes me.
The reason I'm talking about AIG is that they did recently publish this article on their website, a long article looking at defense and attack strategies in the animal world, claiming that, indoctrinating the readers, that these defense and attack structures, these predator-prey relationships and interactions, these were all actually recent changes from a perfect world just a few thousand years ago, a world where all the animals just ate vegetation, the proverbial lion peacefully laying down with the lamb, and children happily putting their hands into the nests of vipers, as the prophet Isaiah would later put it. But now the bodies and behaviors of all these animals have been transformed, degenerated and broken by the destructive influence of human sin on the cosmos. One of the many examples this article talked about is how a simple genetic mutation in the primordial snakes, who again were previously all vegetarian, a simple mutation turned harmless digestive enzymes that previously turned plant starches into sugars. That mutation now turned the enzymes into painful and lethal neurotoxins.
Yeah, it's kind of a magical view, isn't it? I know that in my experience of being a newer Christian and so on, when I was in my late teens and 20, the prevailing view, and it still is really, that when Adam sinned and Eve sinned, there was this kind of almost, magical transformation of the cosmos,
The whole cosmos, not just Adam
No.
and Eve, but the whole universe.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just accepted
Yeah.
by people. I remember being in a Bible study one time, not that long ago actually, and somebody said, well, there was they didn't eat meat in the garden, and somebody objected and said, well, just a minute, where does it say that? And where, like, why are you saying that? What is behind that? And they didn't have any, So it just shows how these ideas just become part of the theology almost unconsciously.
Yeah.
But if you start to dig into it,
Yeah.
it falls apart very quickly.
Getting back to the whole cosmos thing, I remember people were asking Ken Ham, so what about aliens? Are they going to be in heaven? And the response on the website, and I think it was coming, Ken Ham wrote this article, the response was, no, unfortunately, those aliens did not have the benefit of having a Jesus Christ on Earth. They're on some other planet. So unfortunately, they're all going to hell too because of what happened on Earth.
Unbelievable.
It is. It's totally unbelievable. But there you go.
Yeah.
Let's get back to this thing.
Yeah.
This simplistic explanation, again, the whole idea that the snakes, their digestive enzymes got turned into neurotoxins. This ignores a whole field of science that has done a deep dive into the genetic evolution of those venom toxins. And the article also does nothing to explain how the teeth of these previously vegetarian snakes, which should have been molars and incisors if they were only eating plants, how those teeth became long, sharp, and hollow retractable fangs. So we're going to talk to a world-renowned herpetologist, aka a reptileologist, with decades of hands-on experience handling and studying snakes and scorpions, who's popularized his work not just in scholarly scientific papers, but also in over 100 documentaries on platforms that include Animal Planet, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, and the BBC. And he's going to tell us about not only the complex genetic history that produces the cocktail of molecules in the snake's venom, he's also going to talk about the evolution of the snake's body itself. Not just the hollow fangs that are like retractable syringe needles, but also how the snakes gradually lost their limbs, sometimes leaving little fragments of those arms and legs buried deep in the body, and also how they gained dozens more vertebrae and ribs to make them so long and slender, and reshape their mouth, and how the salivary glands did indeed turn into venom sacs with plumbing to connect that to the fangs. He'll talk about the fossil evidence that gives a rough sketch of all those changes, but then the genetic evidence that fills in all the details.
Okay, hold on a minute. I have to object. We know how the snakes lost their limbs. It says that they're in Genesis. It says that now you will crawl along on your belly.
I know that, Scott. You're taunting me. That's not fair. We're also going to talk to an entomologist, someone who studies insects, who will tell us about a fascinating predator-prey relationship between a certain kind of wasp and a cockroach. This wasp captures a cockroach and paralyzes it, then lays an egg on the still-living prey. That egg goes on to develop, in part by progressively eating its way through the prey from the inside out. And once the larva has fully developed, it cuts a hole in the cockroach in order to crawl out as a fully developed jewel wasp.
Yeah, I recently watched a YouTube video on that process, and it was hard to watch.
It's grisly.
Even though it was a cockroach, I'm thinking the poor cockroach,
Yeah.
it's brutal.
Well, so let's let the audience in on this. One of the absolutely fascinating things about this story is that the jewel wasp doesn't just sting its prey indiscriminately. It's a carefully orchestrated dance between the wasp and the cockroach, a precise two-stage attack designed to hijack the cockroach's brain rather than kill the cockroach. The wasp first injects a toxin into one specific part of the cockroach's nervous system to briefly stun the prey. Then it maneuvers around the body of the prey and stings it a second time, but carefully aiming this sting into a different part of the prey's brain, just under the chin of the cockroach, to trigger a few behavioral responses from its zombie prey, which ultimately allows the tiny wasp to lead the zombified cockroach, which is, by the way, significantly bigger, heavier, and stronger than the wasp. But now the wasp can lead it like a dog on a leash by tugging on the cockroach's antenna. And the wasp tugs it into an underground tunnel, then deposits one or two eggs, which spend a month feeding on the still living, at least for the first half of that, zombified cockroach, while they develop into adult jewel wasps.
Yeah, it's just almost beyond words. It's great material for like a horror movie.
Well,
like
it is, right? Alien,
yeah.
Sigourney Weaver.
Yeah, but even the latest apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic show, The Last of Us, I think it's
Right,
called,
yes, yeah.
which is all about parasitic fungus, right?
Yeah.
That's basically evolved to infect humans and zombify them. And
Yeah.
the scary thing about that is that there's some scientific reasons for that could happen in theory. Hopefully not, but
Yeah.
we do see that in nature itself.
Exactly. I wanted to say that we're not just talking about Hollywood, we're talking about real life. This is nature. This is a very complex and amazing predator-prey relationship that not only raises hard questions for the Young Earth Creationists, because again, they didn't think there was any of this on the Earth initially, but also for the intelligent design crowd as they try to explain how a designer imprinted this horrific behavior onto the jewel wasp. Most intelligent design proponents are very careful with their wording. They'll strategically refer to a designer rather than a deity in general, let alone the Judeo-Christian idea of God in particular. And to me, it seems that they deliberately do this to avoid the accusation that they're simply promoting an updated version of creationism. But just the same, it's still fairly obvious that they're referring to the God of the Bible, the God of love. And so here's where it becomes a problem for them, this jewel wasp. The idea of this God of love carefully designing these horrific killing machines that operate through multiple painful stings, briefly paralyzing their prey while they turn the prey's brains into mush, and then lead the prey into a prison cell together with a little baby predator that slowly eats the prey from the inside out. But even that hollowing out of the prey by the baby wasp, that too, it's a carefully pre-programmed behavior that I'll want to talk about with our guest, because the baby has to eat the prey in a way that lets the prey live as long as possible, for days, a couple of weeks, in fact, I think, while it just continues to dine on the roach and mature until it finally, the prey dies and the new wasp crawls out. All of that is just not the best image of the loving God that you want to have to present to your audience. And yet, if you're going to invoke intelligent design for the other unexplainable mysteries that are stunningly precise and elaborate, like a tropical bird that's precisely adapted for one particular species of flower or the migration route of the monarch butterfly, well, you've got to do the same for this barbarous feat of torture and murder, a slow death by syringe needle and soup ladle.
Yeah. In some ways, it's even getting worse because I've just watched a few interesting pieces on the area of intelligence. They've discovered that there's a fish, is elephantine or something like that, small tropical fish, and they've determined that it's self-aware. They've never found this ever in a species this simple, but they basically do this mirror test,
Okay.
and it gets it right. It realizes that it's looking at itself. And this just has blown scientists away. Now, not all fish do this, but this particular one does. And that's really kind of thrown them for a loop. And it kind of demonstrate, there are kind of levels of consciousness even beyond humans. And in a way that makes things worse because that means that, like, I guess I was always somewhat comforted by the fact that in the case like of this wasp, let's say, these are just kind of like almost like robots doing their thing. But there's no consciousness, so there's no real suffering or anything like that. We've got to be careful about anthropomorphizing this, right?
Right.
But, there may be more consciousness than we think in nature. And there may be real suffering. Of course, PETA, the animal rights people, this is their argument, right? That we shouldn't be slaughtering chickens like we do and so on. And to some degree, it's being demonstrated that they might be right to some, to at least to some degree.
Right. So what there then needs to be, you have to have this dialogue between, in this case, the PETA people for the ethical treatment of animals, and scientists, and just talking through some of the, and for that matter, the general public too, talking about how we deal with the use of animals. But in this case, we're not going to be doing that, folks. We're going to be talking about this extreme evolution and how groups like AIG, the Young Earth Creationists, and the intelligent design crowd, how they deal with these things. And so we're going to bring in these two scientific experts, and I want to warn the audience in advance, this is going to be some high-level science that we're talking about with them. It's going to be fairly dense. We've already recorded a conversation with one of them, and I'm actually toying with the idea of releasing two different versions of that interview. One version that's been heavily edited and redacted to remove all the really esoteric, nerdy scientific details and just distill out the main points that the non-experts in our audience will find easy to digest. And then another version of the exact same interview that's uncut, unfiltered, for those in our audience who they like to drink from the fire hose, as it were. And then we've got the second interview with another guest. It'll be just as heavy with the science. So some non-scientifically minded listeners might find these a bit too much. But I think it's important for us to hear these stories from the mouths of the experts, the ones who actually do the work in these areas of the cutting edge of science, in order to cut through the half-truths and misunderstandings that are promoted aggressively by the Young Earth Creationists and ID proponents, who, quite frankly, a lot of them just don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, it is a hard balance to find between being too heavy and too light. And I watch a lot of stuff, especially the stuff on physics. If I understand, honestly, 2% of it, I'd be surprised. But I listen to it anyway because it does still give me a sense, right? And it still helps my understanding to a certain degree. And so I don't mind, this is just me personally talking, but I don't mind when some things go over my head because there's the overall picture that I might not get if somebody just dumbed it down too much.
Right. Well, yeah, so it's the same as learning a new language. At first, you're just learning isolated little words, and it's all memory work. You just have to memorize words and their definitions. But then as you start to immerse yourself in the culture, you listen to the radio shows that are in that language, the words start to build on each other. They start to reinforce each other. And then you find yourself, it's just like it's an exponential climb. And so the same thing in your case, listening to these science shows that are way over your head, the more you do listen to them, you're going to start realizing, holy smokes, I'm getting more and more of this. It's making more sense.
Yeah, you do start to pick some up for sure.
Yeah, not just the words, but the concepts.
Right.
So we're going to talk to these two scientific experts, and again, it's going to be a hard slog for some listeners. And then we're going to look again at how the complete non-experts at AIG have developed a whole industry around butchering that true science, this amazing biology, and how they're misleading uneducated parents and teachers, instilling this pseudoscience into the brains of their children and students. Scott, do you think I'm beginning to project an image of zombified cockroaches onto the image of AIG and ID proponents, distorting the minds of these kids?
It's a possibility.
So after talking to those two experts in their respective fields, we're also going to talk to another fully qualified biological research at a leading university in the United States. And we'll talk about how AIG has been misrepresenting the science and creating bad arguments against evolution and genetics. So what do I mean by bad arguments against evolution? Here's one example. After wrestling for decades with all the problems that come up with the story of Noah's flood, with trying to account for all the diverse types of animals that would have to be on the ark, and not just finding enough space for all the animals, but also all the resources that would have been needed to take care of those animals during the weeks or months that the flood was building and then receding, all the food that would have had to have been eaten, and all the crap that would have been produced. Anyone who's taken care of horses knows firsthand how much work it is shoveling out the stalls. Now, multiply that job, it's not just a few horses, but the equivalent of thousands of horses. All the elephants, bison, giraffes, hippopotamus, wildebeest, you name it. All the animals in the world, pairs of each of them, and only 7 people to do all that shoveling.
That's a lot of shoveling.
It's not just shoveling on the ark, but shoveling from AIG.
Yeah, exactly.
So after enough Young Earth Creationists began to question the credibility of that ridiculous situation, AIG began peddling the argument that, in fact, the ark only carried a small number of protospecies. One protospecies for all the cat-like animals, all the lions, tigers, pumas, panthers, bobcats, and lynx, and of course, the house cat, all coming from one pair of protocats. And then another one for all the dog-like animals, the cow-like animals, one for the birds and one for the rodents. All the animals we now know being represented by a much smaller number of different proto-species. And then those generic proto-species stepped off the ark and began hyper-evolving, a hyper-accelerated form of evolution into all the various species we now know. So AIG are now trying to replace a process that takes millions and billions of years because that's too unbelievable, and by the way, contradicts the literal words on the pages of Genesis chapter 7. They're replacing that with another process that squeezes all that same evolution into a few centuries, or 1,000 years at most, because somehow that's more believable. But at least it's consistent with an ancient description in the biblical text.
Yeah. When you put it the way you've just put it, I like that because it does show that their proposed solution has more problems than just the flat science.
Yes. Yeah. And again, that's just one example of bad arguments for scientific problems aggressively being promoted by AIG, but there are many others, including the evolution of attack and defense structures, this article that they posted a few weeks back, and that's the article we'll be looking at in this miniseries. Now, in the interest of open-mindedness and fair treatment to both sides of an argument, I would have liked to not only bring in these three scientific experts, these bona fide, accredited and practicing scientists, but I also would have wanted to talk to one or more leaders at AIG and or to the leading ID proponents about these same questions and their ideas and what we've learned from talking to scientists. But here's the thing. I've learned from previous experience, numerous times in which I did reach out to them, I've learned that the leaders at AIG just will not talk to anyone who isn't fully drinking their Kool-Aid. Those of us who aren't fully underneath the Young Earth Creationist tent. They've always redirected me to regional AIG representatives. AIG adherents who are their spokespeople in a given region, most of whom I think, or even all of whom, are not experts in the field on which they speak. And in fact, many are not even peripherally qualified to speak on those questions. What I mean is a geologist talking about a biochemical problem. But instead, they've just read the standard AIG party line responses to questions, and they otherwise just dismiss any disconfirming evidence we might ask them to comment on. I don't have time or energy or interest in engaging with those. But while I made no effort to talk directly to the leaders in the Young Earth Creationist world, I did reach out again recently to leaders in the intelligent design world, as I've done before. We'd previously brought in Dr. Michael Behe a couple of years ago in episode 132. Michael was one of the first proponents of intelligent design. And we brought in Dr. Jonathan McClatchy shortly after that in episode 136, and he at the time was a rising star in the ID movement. And I've debated with Dr. Fazal Rana of Reasons to Believe many years ago. Fuzz has now taken over the leadership of Reasons to Believe after Hugh Ross turned over the reins and retired. And in all three cases, I talked straight up about the reasons why I can no longer take intelligent design seriously as a legitimate explanation of some of the biggest questions around evolution and biology. And Scott, you were there for two of those as well. But maybe I burned some bridges there because a couple months ago I reached out again to Reasons to Believe. They had just released a well-produced documentary called Universe Designed, an apologetic effort to appeal to a larger audience to accept intelligent design. And I said I wanted to have an open, friendly, and collegial conversation, not a confrontational debate. I simply wanted to hear their best argument for ID, intelligent design. And so listen to this. I promised to give them, in advance of the conversation, a list of the questions and points I'd want to discuss to give them time to prepare a carefully considered response. And I promised to let them hear the edited episode before it was released, and I promised to honor any requests for further editorial changes to that, including deletions of unwanted segments before it was released, because I'm not trying to beat them in a debate. I just want to hear their best, their most carefully considered arguments. But they weren't interested in being part of any of that.
Yeah, and that kind of says it all, doesn't it?
Right. So let me explain my motives here. I'm now not talking to AIG or ID. I'm talking to my listeners. Long-term listeners will already know this, but we're always getting new listeners who might be wondering what exactly we're doing on this podcast. Why are we always shooting down core Christian beliefs? That's not what we're intending to do. I've got a different agenda, but sometimes that is the ultimate outcome, the collateral damage. I've been on a long journey spread out over decades of putting behind me a faith system that was handed down to me as a child. One no longer works for me in the 21st century. It was a really fundamentalist, young earth creationist, evangelical faith system. But I'm not just letting go of all belief. I'm not becoming a full-on atheist as soon as I hit a little bit of turbulence or a few rough patches. That's too easy. I'll even say that's too lazy to just give up because one or a few things just don't make sense or contradict the Bible. I still find much value within Christian beliefs, and so I'm whittling off the chunks and pieces that I just simply can't accept anymore and working with what's left. And so on one of life's most fundamental questions, what do I believe about how we got here, how the universe and life came to be, the first answer I grew up with was Young Earth Creationism, but that explanation is now just so very far behind me in the rear view mirror. And I think you'd say the same thing too, right, Scott?
Yeah, for sure.
And then the next best explanation, after that Young Earth Creationist explanation, the next explanation for someone who still wants to hang on to the idea that God was involved, that he carefully planned everything, crafted it by hand, simply because that's what the Bible says, then you lessen the emphasis on the specific wording in the Bible and turn the wording into metaphors and say things like God used evolution to do that carefully planned creating. And so then one finds oneself in the world of intelligent design. And I'll admit, it wasn't so long ago, even on this podcast, you would have heard me saying things like God used evolution to make this or that. But intelligent design is a broad spectrum of ideas, and the common thread underlying all the ideas encompassed in this term is the idea that everything was designed. There's intentionality behind all the changes, a goal in moving one form of life to evolve into another, and the ever-increasing complexity. And humans would say that one of those ultimate goals would have been to produce us. We humans think we're the culmination of what the universe and life are all about. But we've already said this more than once. In fact, we've said this a couple times in today's episode. ID may be a satisfying explanation for all the things that you might label good or beautiful or elegant. But what about equally unexplainable, complex, and sophisticated and integrated innovations that are really hard to call good or beautiful or elegant? Many designs look absolutely clunky, like the vertebrate eye or the human spine that causes so much trouble for us. Some designs look silly and useless, like goosebumps on our skin, or bizarre, like using the external parts of our urinary excretion tract to mediate the act of reproduction. What would have been the divine inspiration behind that? Was that some kind of a divine joke on humanity?
Yeah, like the comedian said, why do you put a sewer right in the middle of a recreation park?
Yeah. Yeah. And some designs don't appear to be well thought out. Like we've talked about this, merging the digestive tract and the breathing tube with the unintended consequence of people choking on their food or coughing stomach acid into the lungs. Another poorly thought out design would be inserting the urinary tract in males through the middle of their prostate glands. And then there are designs that appear to be downright malicious, like making females squeeze the head of their babies through a hole in their pelvis that's barely big enough for the baby, resulting in a horrifyingly high rate of deaths in childbirth. Or, we'll find out in the next few weeks, the predation strategies of snakes and the jewel wasp. And these are the things that really call into question, for me, the whole idea of intelligent design.
Yeah, well, for me too. I was quite interested in intelligent design and when it first appeared on the scene kind of thing. And it certainly was being promoted by people with a lot more scientific credentials than, YEC people. And it also embraced many aspects of evolution, including even common ancestry. Michael Behe says he believes in common ancestry. And so what they're trying to say is, okay, we can't deny evolution, so we'll concede that. But we're coming up with a version of evolution that shows that it's this beautifully designed process and points to a creator, therefore. That's what they're trying to do. But for the reasons you've just mentioned and many others, it really doesn't work.
Right. And to be clear, for those who didn't connect the dots, when you say that Michael Behe believes in common ancestry, you correct me if I'm wrong, but what that means is Michael Behe would agree that things did evolve, but at some point God had to step in, or the designer had to step in, take one of these species, one of the genetic codes, and make a tweak, put it back and let it continue, but then he had to jump in again and make some more tweaks, and he's carefully designing along the way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's almost like a Christianized version of Stephen Jay Gould's punctuated equilibrium.
Yeah.
The idea that there's these jumps, and I mean it's not the same, it has echoes of that at least.
Right.
But yeah, it's a real God of the gaps, as we have discussed in the past. It's a
Yeah.
real God of the gaps approach where you've got these seeming chasms where evolution just cannot explain the transition, and therefore it must have been God interfered at that point and designed something, which when you really think about it on the whole, I actually think the young Earth creationists are more consistent in a way, because they just make the whole thing magic. But I mean, you can't argue with
Oh,
magic. But in the case of the design thing, they're trying to be scientific, but then there's these gaps, and the most famous being the development of the flagellum, which we did a series on. And they claim that no way you can explain that outside of a design concept. And in fact, it has been shown that there is an evolutionary explanation for it.
right. So, for all these reasons and more, I'm compelled to set aside intelligent design. I set aside young Earth creationism, and now I set aside intelligent design as a useful explanation for the origin of life and species. But I haven't stopped believing that there's something bigger in this universe than just us humans. I haven't rejected the idea of a higher being of any kind. And so I've been looking into Christian alternatives like open and process theology. We did a deep dive into open and process theology back in episode number 90. That's 90. Which say that God's also on this roller coaster ride called reality. And God's also experiencing it all with us. Even God would agree that there's an element of complete randomness to events, and that some events are just as surprising and disturbing to him as they are to us humans. That's as I understand open and process theology. Is that close, Scott?
Yep. I think that's got the gist of it. And of course, they point to certain uncomfortable verses in the Old Testament for many theologians where God does express a surprise.
Yep. Surprise and regret.
Yeah, in Genesis, he's made humanity and now they're killing each other and everything else. And he's pissed off about it and he's just going to wipe the thing out and start again.
Yep.
So yeah, it's they're trying to face those difficult dilemmas. I'm not a process person, but I do see the appeal of it.
Right. Well, I like it in part because it doesn't attribute these design problems to God.
Yeah.
But the other thing I like about it, they have this idea, and I really need to explore this in more detail for myself before we talk about it, but they keep referring to a lure. Maybe the metaphor of a magnet is a little bit better than a lure. This provides a very subtle tug in a certain direction. It starts to tilt the balance of the scales a little bit in one direction or another, and more importantly, towards goodness and love, community, cooperation, and building. And that lure, that magnet, that doesn't preclude the possibility of catastrophes along the way, and evolutionary dead ends, or even evolutionary hiccups like the ones we've mentioned above, and we're going to look at in the next few weeks.
Right.
And this also helps me with the paradox that I've mentioned more than once on this podcast, that I'm okay with the idea of fine-tuning, but not with the idea of intelligent design. I'm okay with a tuner, but I'm not okay with a designer. Again, the designer would have to explain for all the bad and even malicious designs they've come up with. And I know, okay, so some are going to say I'm effectively putting God on trial. How audacious and blasphemous of me to do that. But is this any different than Abraham supposedly arguing with God about the morality of killing innocent people on his way to the land of Sodom and Gomorrah? Check out chapter 18 in the book of Genesis if you don't know what I mean by that. Or Moses trying to embarrass God out of destroying the Israelites just a few days after they arrived at Mount Sinai. See Exodus chapter 32 for that story.
Or read the book of Job, who's dealing with the whole dilemma of evil at a very deeply personal level.
Yep. So for those reasons, ID just doesn't work for me, but fine-tuning is a whole different kettle of fish. We've done a whole mini-series on that, so I'm not going to recapitulate that whole thing here. The interested listener can go to episodes 164 to 170, 7 episodes. But basically, it's the idea that the very fundamental physical constants of the universe appear to be carefully tuned to produce a universe full of complexity and life. And even many atheistic scientists agree that it all does, in fact, look fine-tuned. And so, they're not going to go so far as to attribute that to a deity. They might nod towards some kind of a higher power with some kind of a cosmic computer and fiddling around with physical constants, and so we're just all simulations on the computer. or they'll accept that the probabilities of it all being accidental are staggeringly infinitesimal, but a grand cosmic accident is more acceptable than invoking a deity. We discussed both of those ideas with an atheistic astrophysicist in episode 167. And as for those of us who might want to try to find God in that fine-tuning or the creative life force that I'm now often referring to, I just don't see anything downright evil or malicious or clunky or poorly thought out in the fine-tuning of the physical constants of the universe, which is in part, we're getting back to that lure, that magnet that's, maybe we need to do an episode to unpack that idea, but I don't see anything malicious in the fine-tuning of the physical constants, but I can't say the same for intelligent design. I can't buy into an intelligent designer, but I'm okay with a fine-tuner.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting way to put it. And I think I'm pretty much with you there. A designer makes it much more like there's one thing to believe that, you have these constants and then the universe unfolds in freedom, and
Yep.
and I think a lot of this does come down to freedom. You could argue, that nature reflects the high cost of freedom,
Yep.
in a sense. And if you believe in some sort of God that wants to create something other than themselves, you would think that that being would want that creation to be free. Otherwise, they're just playing a game with themselves. You know what I'm saying? They're
Right.
not they're not really creating something completely different and completely new. So anyway, that gets into all kinds of other areas of argument. But
Yep.
yeah.
Okay, so we should probably draw a line under this episode, but maybe, do you want to have the last word?
No. That's I'm just really looking forward to these next episodes. As I've expressed many times, although a layperson, I love science, I love nature, and to have the opportunity to talk to these experts on their experiences and really hands-on experiences, especially the fellow with the snakes. It's amazing if you go look at some of his videos and things like that. Yeah, really looking forward to it.
Right. So my goals for today's episode were fairly simple. I just wanted to first explain who we're going to be talking to over the next few weeks, give you guys a fair warning that it's going to be very scientific, and then secondly, to explain why we're doing this. So I just want to do a deep dive into the origin of attack and defense strategies in the animal kingdom. So strap in for the next few weeks. It's going to get very scientific. See you next week.
See you then.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.